Hey, tell us the one about the guy in the white mask.
Again?
Okay. There was this girl named Lori, high school student, honor roll, shy around boys. She got this job, babysitting a couple kids. It was supposed to be $20 for pizza and table and long talks on the telephone with her friends who were supposed to also be babysitting. She wasn't one really to listen to a lot of radio or to turn on the news on television, so she hadn't heard about the escaped maniac from the nearby institution, the insane asylum. It was Halloween night, and she didn't know that he was coming home. In 1978, the murder rate per 100,000 citizens was 9.4%. Compare that with 2018, the last full year we have reliable information for, and you'll find that it's a straight 5%. 1978 represented the end of the century, as the Ramones called it. For so many Americans, it was an extremely violent time of a lot of upheaval and a lot of uncertainty, whether it was the oil crisis, the hostage crisis, or just the spread of urban crime into suburban neighborhoods. There was a ton of just anxiety and worry about the future. Inside that culture, we had to find a way to deal with it. The nightly news by itself was just too depressing and didn't provide any answers, nor any context. This, we would believe, was just the sign of the times. One normal way that people get used to and internalize complex and disturbing information is by telling stories. The tradition of both verbal and then historical folklore has been a tried and true way for people to get their heads around complex, changing, and potentially dangerous situations. This is exactly what blossomed in the late 70s. There was a ton of urban legends that had been brewing since the 1960s that were taking formal root in our society as part of our shared experiences. Everyone knew the story of the vanishing hitchhiker, or the woman with the spiders in the wig, or the snake in the pocket of the used jacket. But they really knew the story of the hook. These stories were all really about class and crime. The fear of used products, or products that are being sold as new but are actually not, was a deep concern for Americans in the late 70s. And with an increasing number of people facing financial hardship, buying used goods was always fraught with difficulty, both to pride and in realistic terms. There was plenty of fraud on the market, so the idea of buying a coat with snake eggs in the pocket was an exaggeration, but it was believable enough. Same thing with the wigs with the spiders, and certainly you didn't want to pick up hitchhikers anymore. Urban legends, however, can only go so far, and the changing landscape was much more in tune with movies and television. It's no coincidence that the psychodrama, which we first saw pop up in the 60s during the first wave of American unrest in the modern period, where we saw Psycho and Peeping Tom and other films like Homicidal come to the forefront of the public consciousness and do very well in the open market, where people could relate to these films where perhaps in the past it really wouldn't have worked. We weren't afraid of our neighbors like we are now. Enter John Carpenter. John Carpenter, unlike those who had gone before, decided to take a codified version of many of those urban legends, kind of compiled together, and make it into an event film, one that would be centered around a holiday that everyone experiences, and one set not in a distant castle in Europe, and not in the inner cities, which many people were becoming overly fearful of. No. This was going to be told in a suburban neighborhood that looked like your suburban neighborhood. And the villain would intentionally look like anyone. Now, any good story starts with its characters. And here, we have three young women at the center of our story. We have Laurie, our clear protagonist. We have Linda, and we have Annie. These are three close high school friends, but they're really as different as they could possibly be, and there's a reason for that from a storytelling standpoint. These three women represent different facets of how 1970s society viewed young women. Laurie is very much the traditional 1950s sort of female protagonist. She's pure, she's virginal, she's innocent, she's naive, she's shy. But what she isn't is particularly modern. She's idealized to a certain level for traditionalists. Now, Linda is exactly the opposite. Here's a young woman who could care less about her schoolwork, is running around with her boyfriend having premarital sex. People often talk about premarital sex as a trope of the genre, but I don't think they look any deeper. It's not necessarily a puritanical ritual, the murder of these promiscuous girls. Instead, what they're really doing, especially in Halloween and some of the better made imitations of Halloween, is they're projecting on society and what society suggests is okay for a young woman to do. Now that's fraught with sexism, there's no question about it. It doesn't really fly today, although the tradition continues because traditions continue. Linda is a representation of the fears of the anti-Laurie. She's the woman who's going to do exactly what she wants when she wants. Tradition be damned. She's all about the moment. She's all about what pleasures her right now. In that respect, she's as much a villain of the piece from its own standpoint as Michael Myers. So there's a collision path between these two young ladies, and right in the middle of them is Annie. Now, Annie is very much exactly the 1978 young woman in high school. She has a boyfriend, and she's active with that boyfriend, but it's always kind of a little bit more restrained, right? She's a little bit more reasonable. She cares about her friends. She's actually pretty decent to her father, who they have a kind of awkward relationship, but it's a respectful relationship. Annie's important too, because she is where women were in 1978. So it really sets up a stark contrast between Laurie, the idealized 1950s portrayal of femininity, and Linda, the fear of the future. Whose fear of the future? Well, horror films have been accused of being either extremely conservative or extremely liberal. Truth is, this was really just a snapshot, and it's not making any representation of what the future should look like. It's not making a recommendation that we side with any of these three women's morals. What it is, however, doing is making a comment about how we view the situation. Michael Myers is a man in a mask. He is the silent onlooker. He is the audience in many respects. So he's looking at these three girls with very different moral outlooks, and he makes a judgment on them. Almost a godly judgment, and that's where the puritanical concept comes from. But it's really not puritanical as much as it's asking the audience to pay attention to how they're feeling. It's a social criticism, not a pronouncement of how things should be. Now, as I said in the beginning, Halloween is really a social story. And what it's really talking about is the fears of the urban crisis on the American suburbs, which is considered the center of America or the heart of America. The idea is that those bad influences out there are changing our young women. And Laurie can only survive if she embraces her traditional role of protector of children and the maternal figure, which she does in the movie. And thus she survives. You must look a little bit deeper, though, because Michael Myers himself is an interesting non-character. Michael Myers represents the fear of that outside, of that urbanity. The Smith Grove institution is a substitute for society outside the safe comfort of the polite middle-class neighborhood in the suburbs. He comes from a place where we hide people away. Those where the dangerous people live. When he returns, when he comes home, the danger is that subversive element, that dangerous element that is attacking our children's morality, because horror films are about morality and mortality. Often those two are interchangeable, ultimately, because we're talking about dramatic plays and morality plays. Michael Myers returns to Haddonfield because the evils began in Haddonfield. That's perhaps what gets missed a lot, again, with the puritanical argument, is that it doesn't suggest that the evil actually started out there where we shut things away. It started right in our living rooms, where Judith Myers is making out with her boyfriend rather than taking Michael trick-or-treating. Michael Myers returns because Michael Myers never really left. And that's what Halloween is. It's an indictment of the idea that we cannot bury our secrets, and we can't hide them behind folklore and urban legends. Instead, we must confront them and take care of our children. Now consider Dr. Loomis, who is a gatekeeper. He's the guy who's supposed to keep those crazy people at bay. He's the person who's supposed to heal the sick and make them into normal, polite suburbanites. He spends the entire film saying that Michael Myers is not insane. He's not a madman. He's something worse. He's something more dangerous. He's something more insidious and evil and from the old world that we keep wanting to lock away. We keep wanting that. He wants to lock him away. He thinks he should never have come out because he's looked into his eyes. When he says he looked into his eyes, that kind of neatly refrains with a lot of the political speech from the last 30 years where we talk about looking in leaders' eyes and seeing good or bad people. There's some kind of moral judgment that's capable of just looking at someone. It's not my belief, but the movie posits it. Dr. Loomis believes that Michael Myers is evil because he represents all the sins of our society. But no one believes Dr. Loomis. He goes around the whole film talking in verse about how evil Michael Myers is, and it's almost like he's singing a folk song about Michael Myers, as if Michael Myers perhaps is the Johnny Appleseed of the clinically insane. But no one believes him, not the police and not anyone else he comes into contact with, until he shoots Michael repeatedly from a balcony. And at that point, the movie embraces Dr. Loomis. Because Dr. Loomis is saying, I can't hide your sins away anymore. I can't protect your children. The best I can do is stand in its way. Halloween ends with an unsettling note. The movie that we've watched before would be easy to be seen as a psychodrama, just like Psycho or Peeping Tom. But it actually isn't. It's actually more in the tradition of Dracula or The Mummy. It is about ancient evil. It's about societal ills. It's a film about our failings as human beings. Now, there's a temptation, of course, to say, oh, well, Lauren, that all sounded wonderful, but you're probably pulling it out of your ass. Well, I'll ask you this. Why does this film resonate with us when so many other slashers have come and gone, barely get remembered, might get released onto DVD, might get a little bit of conversation when some deluxe edition comes out, and then we don't talk about it for another 15 years? Why did Halloween never go away? Why did this film stick out? Because it means something, that it hits us in that little tingle in the back of our skull that convinces us that we're watching something important, something that's about us. We look at the characters on screen, we recognize them as people that could very, very easily exist in our life. And that's powerful. Halloween is a remarkable work. It's not a perfect film. There's plot problems here and there. They're minor, but they exist. How does Michael Myers learn to drive? How does he get to town without GPS? There's problems, but none of it matters because we're going on that logic of the urban legend. And the film is explicitly setting us up to deal with its logic in those terms. As such, it's one of the greatest horror films ever made, and I'd even say one of the greatest films ever made. It's not to say it's necessarily my favorite, because it doesn't crack my top 10. But what it does do is cast this immense shadow over all horror films that came after it. In that respect, it's almost the Rosetta Stone of horror. Before Halloween, one type of film existed in the horror genre. After Halloween, another one did. Being part of the slasher subgenre doesn't mean it hasn't affected every other horror film that's come in its wake. If you look at it stylistically or just how its screenplay is set up, it becomes very obvious that this is a monumental film that should never, ever be underestimated.